The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Kay Reed, the Executive Director of the Dibble Institute. And I would like to welcome you all to the July 2018 Dibble webinar on, Kathy, can you go back a few, please?
There you go, sorry.
On adverse experiences and really the prevalence of them, especially since many of us are interested in this topic from a more academic, high-level point of view. We wanted to ask David Murphey to join us on this webinar. So, hi, David.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And Kathy Guidry is our engineer.
Hi, how are y'all doing today?
All righty, so a few things about the webinar. The next slide, Kathy. So if you can't access it through your computer, please call the number on the screen. It's also on your invitation. We will be answering your questions. So please, if you have questions, please write it into your little question box. We also will be asking you to raise your hands, and David has some poll questions. So please feel free and do participate. So actually, I am going to ask the first question, and that is, raise your hand if this is the first Dibble, is this the first Dibble webinar you've attended? Please raise your hand if this is your inaugural Dibble webinar. So please raise your hand if it's your first webinar. Okay. Someone asked, will they be able to hear if they are taken off mute? You will remain muted, but you should all be able to hear. So if you can't hear us, please check your own audio controls on your computer or on your headsets, or use the phone. So, all right. So of the people, hands raised. So almost half of you, this is your first webinar with us. So welcome. We appreciate you being here. And to those of you who are old hands at this, we're glad to have you back. Kathy, the next slide. Let me give you a little bit of background about the Dibble Institute. This is Charlie. I want to introduce you to Charlie and Helen Dibble. They started the Institute back in the early 90s. Charlie had retired as an engineer with General Electric. And when he retired, he started doing youth work. So he kind of brought that engineering perspective to his volunteer work. And he saw a lot of his young friends' lives change as their parents' circumstances and their parents' marriages changed. And so he spent a lot of time researching what that was about and what could be done so that families could be built to be strong and safe and stable to raise children in. So Kathy, the next slide. So he started the Dibble Institute, and here we are some 27 years later. We are a nonprofit, independent organization, national organization. And what we do is we translate research into teaching tools that help young people get smart about their love lives. And when I used to say that, people, you could just get the sense like, that's so sweet, but it doesn't really mean anything. But what we've learned through research over the years is that teaching young people efficacy around their romantic relationships has huge impacts on other parts of their lives. Their sexual behavior changes to be more positive, their violence is reduced, their connections with their parents or other trusted adults increase. So anyway, we're thrilled to be able to do this work. Last year we estimate we, and I'm going to put air quotes around we, reached over 76,000 youth in America with one of our programs. Now that those air quotes around we means that the Dibble Institute is not a direct provider of services. We make available, we sell our research-based, evidence-based materials to people in community organizations and schools and state governments and other groups like that who want to use them to accomplish their goals with young people. So just for you who get to know us, that's a little bit about Dibble. So let's, next slide, Kathy. Some core values about Dibble. First of all, we believe in research. This is where Charlie started this out, that you need research. That's where, that's the basis of everything we do. It also means that sometimes our findings change because we have more data, we have more information. But basically, if we have any ideology, it is that we believe in science and we believe in research. Okay, the next slide. We're also big fans of stable, healthy families. And actually, we will get, when David completes the webinar today, we will then connect the dots about why having David here talking about the prevalence of ACEs is actually important to Dibble's work. We recognize that there are thousands, countless, amazing single parents who every day put one foot in front of the other to make a good life for their kids and do great. But if you ask them, they will tell you it's really, really hard. It's hard financially, it's hard physically, it's hard socially, it's hard spiritually. It's really, really tough. And they would probably, not all of them, but probably wish, you know, it would be different for their kids or if they had made different choices. But we certainly mean no disrespect for single parents. We also aren't supportive of, you know, families where violence or abuse is the norm. So when there are abusive relationships or people are abusing substances or themselves or others, or there's high conflict, those relationships, those families, it's safer for kids if they go away. But there are a lot of instances where families can be strengthened, parenting can be improved, relationships can be improved, and that's really what we're looking for, is helping people achieve for themselves the goals that they have set up. And lastly, we believe that all young people should deserve respect, and all relationships can get better with the application of relationship skills. So we intentionally write our materials to not assume the gender of anyone's partner. It's very inclusive. We use inclusive language, and our programs are utilized with diverse communities, both culturally diverse, ethnically diverse, and also in regards to who you love diverse, are used in a lot of different settings. So just to let you know that. So Kathy, the next one. I am thrilled today to present to you David Murphey. He's a research fellow and director of the Child Trends DataBank in Philadelphia. He's worked in state government, where he helped lead Vermont's communities to adopt results-based frameworks, which is so important to all of our work. He has a Ph.D. and a master's from the University of Michigan. Isn't that go blue? Anyway, with great delight, I present David. Thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Kay and Kathy, for the invitation to reach out to an audience that's probably new to me, and I hope we can all learn something from each other. I will just briefly introduce Child Trends. If you don't know about it, I urge you to take a look at our website. We are the only independent research organization that's focusing on all issues concerning children and families. And our mission since 1979 has been to improve the lives of children and youth through high quality, accessible research. So our mission is very closely aligned with what you just heard from Kay, is the mission of the Dibble Institute. So this is a natural partnership, I think. So as Kay mentioned, we're going to try to have this be somewhat interactive and not have you just listen to me. And let's run the first poll question now, just as a way to introduce this topic of adverse childhood experiences. So I don't know how many of you have done something like this before, but no one's going to see how you vote, so it's totally anonymous. Trauma's effects on children are choose one of these answers and just see how much you may know already. I'm sure some of you know quite a bit. And wow, we've got a very savvy audience here. The correct answer, of course, is it's both psychological and physical effects of trauma. So I'm talking to a quite well-educated audience here, and we'll just move along to the next slide. Maybe you'll ace this whole sequence of poll questions. But let's talk a little bit about what childhood trauma is. Trauma is a word I think that many of us are familiar with in terms of something that happens in a terrible car crash or on the football field. And what we've understood in the last 20 or 30 years of research is that it can extend to a number of threatening experiences that we now call adverse experiences. So trauma often produces what is termed toxic stress. We know that not all stress is bad. A certain level of stress can help us actually perform better at what we do, whether it's athletic activity or meeting a deadline or writing a paper or something like that. Some of us perform actually better when we're under a little bit of stress than we do when there's no stress at all. And then there's other stress that is difficult to cope with, but it's still manageable. But then there's a third level of stress that we talk about that's toxic stress. That's typically this is stress that is overwhelming or repeated or cumulative. And of course, children are especially vulnerable because their brains are still in development. And as we saw in the poll just now, by definition, this toxic stress can actually change basic biology. So particularly immune, endocrine, neurologic systems, and even in some cases our genes. So it's important to emphasize a couple of points here. Trauma is not a single event. It can accumulate over time. And we know that also the evidence for the harm that trauma can cause is clearest when children have experienced multiple stressful experiences. That is stress that accumulates over a long period of time. So some people make a distinction between trauma that is catastrophic versus trauma that is more routine or almost becomes like a part of daily life. People talk about microaggressions being an example of trauma that people in groups that have historically been the target of bias, for instance, have to put up with day in and day out. So I think it's important to understand that trauma comes in many different forms and is also experienced differently by children of different ages. But let's move on now to the next slide and talk a little bit about what kinds of experiences are associated with childhood trauma. One common misunderstanding is that there's a definitive checklist of adverse experiences, and this is not the case. There is no comprehensive, definitive list of these experiences. So most survey items draw on extensive clinical experience of what are the stressful life events, but I'm sure we can all add to this list. This list happens to be the list of adverse childhood experiences that was included in the National Survey of Children's Health, which is the data source that I'll be referring to during this presentation to talk about the prevalence of ACEs. But I'm sure we can add, all of us, especially in light of some of the recent headlines, we can add other stressful life events to this list. Violent contact with the police, exposure to lead, harassment and bullying, separation of family members, natural disasters, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, this list is kind of without end, but for practical purposes, many of the researchers who measure adverse childhood experiences use a list that's fairly similar to this one, and you'll notice a few commonalities in this particular list. More than one of these adverse childhood experiences or ACEs have to do with relationships, close relationships with someone in the family. Several of them have to do with violence. These are themes that tend to permeate throughout these lists of childhood adverse experiences. And I do carefully use the word associated with childhood trauma because it's not an ironclad relationship. Just because you live with someone, a parent who got divorced or separated, for instance, does not mean that you're going to have the experience of trauma or toxic stress. As we'll be seeing in the next few slides, a lot depends on the other circumstances in the child's life, and as well as some characteristics of the child, him or herself. So I don't want to imply that that because you've had one or even more than one of these experiences that you've been traumatized or that you're having to deal with toxic stress. We know that human beings in many circumstances can be very resilient, and I hope to say more about that as we move along, and maybe there'll be some other questions along those lines. So at this point, let's go to the next slide. And again, seeing that many of the people who are tuning into this webinar seem to be familiar with the research on ACEs, I probably don't need to linger too much on this, but what the research has found is that there are consequences, of course, in childhood trauma. The first consequences of childhood trauma, the first research actually was focusing more on the consequences in adulthood, which included increased susceptibility to a variety of physical illnesses, engaging in risky behavior, sexual behavior, drug and alcohol abuse, increased risk of mental illness, shortened life expectancy. But now we know that actually through research that the consequences of childhood trauma show up in childhood as well, and those include social emotional behavior problems, violence against self and others, and also increased susceptibility to physical illness. So sometimes there's a delayed effect, sometimes there are more immediate effects, sometimes they're both. I guess I can add a few things to this list. I know among some of the behavioral problems that have been reported in childhood for those children who've experienced trauma are also the behaviors that parents and teachers see a lot of are problems with attention, problems with focusing, problems with self-regulation and impulse control, that type of thing. So let's run poll question number 2 at this point. So this is the idea, the impact of toxic stress in any given situation. And here's a list. Please vote. And the correct answer, wow, everybody's right on the money again.
You're giving them softball questions, David.
I was going to say,
no, we have a very smart audience.
I'm sure you do. I don't mean to insult your intelligence, but on the other hand, it can be validating, can it? The answer right. All right, so let's go ahead and show the next slide. that would be going the other direction. So we've already seen this one. But so it depends. Just as that quiz question suggested, there's not a hard and fast relationship between experience and its consequences. So what is traumatic for one child may not be for another child. Some children we know are more resilient. That resilience can be due to some genetic factors as well as other factors. We talk about plasticity of the child's brain. Now that cuts both ways. I mean, plasticity, of course, is a term that refers to how at an early age the brain is malleable, is still under development, as I said earlier, and which means that it can be affected for better and for worse. So because it's under development, in some ways it's more vulnerable, but it's also in a state where it can recover also. Not always and not always completely, but in many cases it can recover given the right circumstances from trauma. The brain has a remarkable ability to rewire itself to find alternate pathways if the original pathway has been compromised in some way. So without getting too much into brain biology, we can talk about plasticity as being for better and for worse. But the key thing here, I think, is this fourth bullet, that it's really relationships that matter the most. The thing that comes through loud and clear in all the research is the key factor in overcoming the potentially toxic effects of trauma, is having a caring adult who acts to buffer that stress. It's the relationship with that adult, particularly relationships that are safe, that are supportive, that are nurturing, that are characterized by warmth, responsiveness to the child, and low conflict. So those are some of the key characteristics of these relationships that are positive for the child. There's still a lot more we need to learn about what makes for resilience in the face of adversity. All of us can probably think of examples of children we've known or children we've read about that have come through incredibly horrific circumstances and are able to overcome those, surmount those to a degree where they can actually lead very successful lives. By the same token, there are other children who go through similar experiences and are really severely harmed by them, and they're not going to bounce back. So I mentioned, I think, or said that some of these are factors that may be individual to a child, and we know that some of these include sort of general intelligence, flexibility, the ability to plan, exercise self-control, and of course some of these characteristics aren't developed, until a child is certainly, close to school age or something like that. So we wouldn't, an infant wouldn't normally even have some of these characteristics, but there's certainly a wide range of susceptibility among children to both adversity and to positive interventions. So it sort of works the same way that I was referring to plasticity earlier. There are some children who just seem to be more sensitive to both adverse events and to the compensating effects of nurturing relationships, for instance, and others who may be more or maybe less susceptible to both the damaging effects of adversity, but also perhaps responsive to interventions. So it's a complicated picture, which again we can, if there's time toward the end of the webinar, I'm happy to discuss further. But let's just remember at this point that it's relationships that really matter. I think we can remember the words of Kay in the introduction here, you know, how important it is for parents to really model those kinds of positive relationships with their partner, and then again, if and when they have children. So let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, so everything up to now has really just been giving you some background, and as we've seen, you all have a good deal of background in this topic already. So maybe what I'll have to say now will be breaking some new ground for at least some of you. We are fortunate to have data now, national data, that is data that are nationally representative of children in the US in terms of their exposure to ACEs. And our most recent data come from the 2016 administration of the National Survey of Children's Health. You can see some of the characteristics of that data collection here. The important thing to remember is that it's a parent or other knowledgeable adult who's answering about one of their children. So these are not children reporting themselves on what they've experienced with the parent. This survey, fortunately, is now an annual survey, so we're going to have updated national data every year, and state level data, which has always been a feature of this survey. One of the few data collections that we have that does produce reliable state level data for all of our 50 states plus the District of Columbia. Updated state level data will be available, I think, more like every 2 years because of sample sizes. But this is a key resource for researchers, but also for communities across our country to understand the health and well-being of our nation's children and families. Let's move to the next slide. So how common are ACEs? Here you see all 9 of the ACEs that are measured on the survey. This is children birth through 17. You can see that by the individual ACEs measured, by far the most common are economic hardship and divorce or separation of a parent. Each one reported by about 1 in 4 parents of children. And then the others below 10%, but some of the higher ones are having a parent who's ever served time in jail, living with someone who had an alcohol or drug problem, living with someone who was mentally ill or suicidal. So I'll just reiterate here that these are percentages who experience each type of experience, and many children have had 2 or more of these. So the same child can have experienced more than one of these. Sometimes this is called poly-victimization or poly-victims. It's kind of an unfortunate term, but we know that these children are especially at risk if they've, as I said earlier, if they've experienced multiple ACEs. And here, let's jump, if we can, to poll question number 4. So not the next question in the list. We'll skip over that next one and move to the 4th one. So just curious whether people, what people might think about this one, looking at some differences by race and ethnicity. Okay, and a little bit of variation here, but by far the most popular answer is number 4, and that is the correct answer. Let's unpack that a little bit more. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So there are many ways to slice and dice these data, and I'll be showing you a couple of different ways that we look at it. But this is another way to look at prevalence. You know, the earlier slide that we just saw a minute ago was looking at individual ACEs. This slide, this chart is looking at the percentage of children with no adverse experiences, and then at the other end of the spectrum, those who've had 2 or more, and breaking each of those groups out by race and Hispanic origin. So one of the numbers that's not shown here is that if we collapse race and Hispanic origin, so looking at that left-hand side group of bars, it's about 54% of all children have not had any ACEs, which is good. That's just a bare majority. And then collapsing all 3 of the bars on the right, the percentage, which is not shown here, is 22% overall have had 2 or more adverse experiences. So 1 in 5 of our children in the U.S. have had 2 or more adverse experiences. And again, these are children of all ages, 0 through 17. So obviously, the older, the more years you've been alive, of course, the more opportunities you've had to accumulate ACEs. But I believe the data show that even among our youngest children, there's a sizable group who've had more than one. But there's a couple of things to note here. ACEs are especially, multiple ACEs are especially high among Black children. And it's not shown here, but prevalence is also much higher among children who live in poverty, even though poverty is, or economic hardship is one of the ACEs. If we look at just all the 8 other ACEs in addition to poverty, those poor children are much more likely to experience these adverse experiences than children in higher income families. So again, more evidence for the many disparities that we have in this country that are related to income, that are related to race and Hispanic origin. It's very disturbing that we are really moving in some ways in the wrong direction in terms of lessening those gaps between people who are relatively more advantaged and those who are less so. So where we're going to go next is to take a more, somewhat more fine-grained look. People are always curious, and naturally so, to understand more, well, what about where I live? What is the prevalence of ACEs? So again, we're not going to have the time to go into all the detail that we might. We'll refer you to some other resources later, but let's take a look at the next slide just as one example. Okay, so this is, I apologize for the density of the information here, but I will give you the highlights so you don't have to squint too much and read every line here. So we broke the United States into 9 regions, and in every region we broke down, in this case, the percentage of children with 2 or more ACEs, which is what we know to be a higher risk group. That is a group of children who are more at risk for the kinds of issues, behavioral problems, physical illness, problems with attention, difficulties in school, those kinds of things. We broke those out by race and Hispanic origin. And wherever we look in the U.S., in any of these 9 regions, there are disparities, although the size of these gaps vary. So for instance, in the mountain region, so this lighter green part of the country that kind of runs up through the Rocky Mountains, down into Arizona and New Mexico, and also in the west, south, central, that region is purplish, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas. The proportion of Black children who have 2 or more ACEs is more than double that for white children. In contrast, that disparity is much lower in the West and North Central, which is Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska. So this is in a region that's adjacent to both the other two regions that I just mentioned, as well as in New England, where that gap is much lower. So there's a lot we don't understand probably about all the explanations for that variance in the size of that gap. But I think it certainly raises lots of interesting questions that people in those regions need to take a hard look at. So I'll just point out a couple other things here. So the reference group is, in all cases, is white non-Hispanic children, and the yellow shading designates a percentage that is significantly higher for that race or Hispanic group than the corresponding percentage for white children. A blue one designates a percentage that's significantly lower, and pink is a percentage where we really need to interpret it with caution because of a very small sample size. So this is an example of the kind of analyses that we can do with these National Survey of Children's Health data. And this comes from a report that Child Trends put out earlier this year. We'll be providing a link to that report for you at the end of the webinar. Let's run, if we can, poll question number 5, the last poll question here. Being trauma informed, that's kind of a buzzword these days. Is it important primarily for pediatricians, for foster parents, for biological parents, or all of the above? And I have a feeling I'm going to not be surprised by the results here. I was going easy on you, folks. Let's see the results. Okay. All right. Well, again, I certainly had no intention of insulting your intelligence, but you are all very on the ball people here because, of course, the answer is all of the above. Let's talk about what trauma informed means and other kinds of policy responses to this really very extensive and serious problem that we've come to recognize. So we can go to the next slide. And this is not at all a comprehensive list. And I'm sure many of our listeners will maybe have some helpful things to add to it. But some of the policy responses that have been suggested are, one thing we can do is encourage regular screening for ACEs during a well child visit that children have with their pediatrician. Another type of response is that has taken hold in many areas of the country is to administer state or community-specific surveys for ACEs, and I think the primary value here is that it raises the level of awareness. When you collect data that are local, that are about the community that you live in, it's harder to ignore. It really hammers the point home that there are children who have been through significant experiences that, if not responded to in a sensitive way, can really lead to a number of difficulties and challenges in life that are going to be expensive for society to cope with, be hurtful for children and for families, and be very distressing. So I think getting the word out about prevalence and ideally making the data as local as possible, I think is often the key to rousing public will and getting people to pay attention. I think another policy response that goes a little deeper is the increasing recognition that many of our interventions for families really need to explicitly be two-generation interventions that focus simultaneously on parents as well as children, because they're really joined at the hip. And we see this, there's accumulating evidence that ACEs that parents experience can transfer some of the negative impacts of those experiences can be transmitted to their own children, and they in turn can pass it on to the next generation if they're not addressed, if parents are not given the tools and the support to move to a better place, to understand what's happened to them, to learn some new ways of coping, new ways of handling emotion, new ways of parenting, so that they don't duplicate or replicate what happened to them. So we, in line with that, we also see more communities, I think, taking seriously the issue of how to support parents, whether it's through granting more parental leave or adopting home visiting and other strategies that can reduce stress and create more nurturing relationships and environments. And of course, that encompasses many things. I think personally that it's got to include restricting availability of firearms and confronting the really culture-wide endorsements of violence that I think are evident in our media, in our well, it's part of our history really that we need to grapple with. I mean, this is not a new idea, but so many of the ACEs have to do with violence, and we know that children don't even have to experience violence as a direct victim, that simply witnessing violence is damaging to children. So I think we need to really think seriously about what we're exposing our children to, whether it's in our neighborhoods, in our homes, on our screens, et cetera, et cetera. So happy to hear others' views on that, but let's move to the next slide. So becoming trauma informed, and again, I won't linger on this. It sounds like people are pretty trauma informed in this audience. So we've already talked about some of the different groups in a community that can benefit and should benefit from becoming trauma informed. Let's actually move to the next slide. Not everyone can be trained as a clinician, but that doesn't mean that not everyone, that it still means that many of us can learn at least a minimum of information and some skills about how to be trauma informed. So excuse me while my computer just went to sleep, but now it's woken up. So people talk about the 4 R's, and I'm sure this is not the only definition of being trauma informed, but if you haven't seen this before, I'll briefly go through it with you. So becoming trauma informed is when a program, an organization, or system realizes, first of all, the widespread impact of trauma. That's what we've been covering in the last half an hour or so, understanding this is not a special problem of a small group of people. This is a very widespread issue. We come to recognize, the second R, the signs and symptoms of trauma in our clients, in our families, and our staff, and that we respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices, and we seek to actively resist re-traumatization. That's so unfortunate that when we're not informed about this issue, we really run the risk of re-traumatizing the people that we are trying to help, and that can take the form of not being sufficiently sensitive to the kinds of settings that we provide for people, the use of armed guards or security personnel, or the ways in which we subject people endless registration forms where they have to recite the same information about what happened to them without any regard to how that may be re-traumatizing a victim. I'm sure you can think of other examples. I think we should all think about what practices in our family serving systems might risk either re-traumatizing the child or re-traumatizing a parent, because there's a lot of already traumatized people out there. So again, we don't want to add to the challenges that they have. Let's run poll question number 3. Okay, so this is sort of a final quiz. Again, I'm not going to be surprised by the results. This is just to test see if you're still awake here 45 minutes into this webinar. I hope you are. The correct answer, of course, is number 1. So thank you all. I'm going to just close with a couple more thoughts here, and then we can go to the next slide. So I've spoken about some additional resources, Child Trends being one, the Data Resource Center for Child and Adolescent Health is an online tool for accessing the National Survey of Children's Health data. I think it's fairly user-friendly, and you can designate which state or even two states that you want to compare, and choose the measure, including the ACEs measure, and it will it's a fairly easy way to pull down some data in charts or tables. ACEs Connection is a community, an online community, if you will, that does a lot of great work in terms of connecting work on this topic around the country. So researchers as well as practitioners. There's a very helpful state policy guide that this last bullet here that's put out by the Futures Without Violence organization. And of course, there are many, many more resources than these. I've only selected a few here. So the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, of course, is an excellent resource. And I'd be happy to hear other people's ideas too. But I wanted to leave some time for questions. I've really been privileged to share some of my knowledge with you, and I'd love to hear from some of you.
Great, because we have 14 questions, David. So,
hey,
so let's start with this is the easy one from Gail.
Okay.
In the survey, of ACEs with one of those early slides, what ages were the children that they were looking at?
All ages, so 0 birth through 17. And remember, it's asking the parent to reflect. So however old the child is that we're focusing on, if it's your 5-year-old, how many of these ACEs have they experienced? Or if it's your 12-year-old, how many has she experienced? Ever. So we don't know. One of the shortcomings is we don't know when in the child's life it may have occurred. We don't. So, but it's certainly better than not having any information at all.
Sure. Stephanie asks, says that she thinks it's important to discuss, quote, being treated or judged unfairly due to race or ethnicity. Why is that number so low? And does this have something to do with the sample? The fact that their parents weren't incarcerated?
That's I'm glad one of the listeners raised that point. We were troubled by those data too. Frankly, we don't think those data are good. And so we actually left that question off of our particular analysis that we did for our own report. I think it may be that parents are not the best reporters on this issue, that they may not always know what their children have experienced when it comes to racial discrimination. It also may be that children don't always process it that way or label it that way. But for whatever reason, those national numbers do seem low to us at Child Trends as well. Some other surveys certainly have that have used a similar question come up with higher percentages. So I think there's reason to be skeptical. I think this area deserves more work. We need to understand perhaps better ways of asking the question, better examples to give of what it is that we're talking about. So much of racism also occurs not necessarily at a personal level, although it does there too, but at institutional, systemic levels. So there are many layers to this.
Sure. So this is somewhat related. Sharon asked 2 questions about, does this national survey look at traumas related to migration, immigration, and then going a little bit deeper, related to traumas or adverse experiences in the country of origin, during the immigration process, and then when settled in the U.S. So it doesn't look like, it sound like this survey does, but do we have data on that?
If the questioner would like to get in touch with me through email, I'd be happy to check when I'm back at my desk about what we might have on that. I don't think there's any comprehensive data. It's so difficult to collect data on this population who are, of course, already going through so much, and the resources are so strained to help them that to sort of impose an additional burden on them by thrusting a questionnaire at them may not make the most sense. But yes, I think we all could wish that the list of adverse experiences could be expanded to include this or that.
Sure.
But it is what it is. I think there's no doubt in anyone's mind who has studied this issue that separating children from their parents is a horrific thing to do, and typically results in terrible trauma.
All right, next question is, why was physical and sexual abuse and neglect not considered in the questions, or I guess maybe in the results you showed? Yeah.
Sure. It certainly was considered, but because it's typically parents who's reporting on this, we didn't think it likely that they would be reliable or honest reporters. So much child maltreatment is actually at the hands of a parent. So there's sort of there's an oblique reference to violence experienced, at home or in the neighborhood. But no, we were not in the National Survey of Children's Health. There is not an item that looks directly at child maltreatment.
Because usually the ACEs includes that. So
yes, and certainly if you're asking adults to reflect on their own childhood, right?
Right. Do you have any data for American Indian or Alaskan Native youth, or do we know where to find any of that?
Yes, you can the website childhealthdata.org, at least with the national data, will give you some of these results by race that include American Indians and that include Alaska Natives. Unfortunately, the sample sizes get pretty small for some of the states. It may be that when we can accumulate several more years of data, we'll have adequate sample sizes to, at least for the states with larger populations of these subgroups, to have valid data. But it's right now it is a defect of our current knowledge.
Okay, we're going to keep going. People keep asking more questions faster than I can answer them. Get you answer them. Okay. What does the literature tell us thus far about the most effective interventions, strategies, policy measures for preventing or intervening in ACEs? Yes,
well, of course, that can't be a more important question. I think the short answer is we do know a lot about what works. There are many parenting programs, that is, programs to help parents do a better job at parenting that have been shown to be effective. Then there are also things that we can do at more of a policy level. I mean, we have the highest rates of incarceration in the world, and I think we need to take a close look communities, and whether for some types of offenses that really may not be the appropriate response. Those are a couple of ideas. Obviously, there's some things we'll never be able to prevent. I mean, parents are going to die, untimely deaths. That's happened throughout history, and children are going to, in many cases, recover from that. People are working in substance abuse and mental health to address some of the issues that parents have. I think we need to, in general, do a much better job of supporting families in the very challenging role of parenting that they have. So whether it's by giving access to family leave, getting families better, higher wages, better health insurance. I mean, this is my answer is long for this, and so in the interest of fairness to the other questions, I guess I'll leave it at that.
There you go. Is there any research that's been done or being done that tries to understand why there are such differences by geographic location and race? Like the difference between California and Mississippi.
Right. Well, recall that the most common of these 9 ACEs was economic hardship. And second of all was parental separation or divorce. So certainly there's a link with poverty. I think there can also be a link with isolation and the mental health issues that sometimes accompany that. So whether we know we've got high rates of depression in this country, we certainly have high rates of poverty. A place like Mississippi has for generations been struggling with very high rates of poverty, and particularly child poverty, and the safety net there is honestly pretty thin. So it's a combination of both the circumstances that families are facing, and then either the presence or lack of safety net or social support programs to help them kind of ride out those tough times. I think that may account for some of these regional differences, but again, there's certainly a need for more research along those lines.
Okay, 2 questions about violence in the media, either in video games or movies, TV, songs. So do those both traumatize or have a potential to re-traumatize people?
I think they have the potential. Again, there are going to be individual differences depending on an individual child's circumstances. I think that some children are more susceptible to that than others. I think most experts, researchers who study the impact of the media, recommend that if parents are going to allow children to watch shows with violent content, it's really a good idea for a parent to watch with them and to help them interpret what they're seeing and understand the difference between real violence and simulated violence, and also to just provide a context here. Is this how you would like to be treated? Or is this how do you think they could have addressed that problem differently? And I think we need to raise alternatives to violence and not have it just be seen as the default response mode when someone insults you or somebody disses you or somebody, you have a conflict. I think violence is a very appealing. It obviously has a certain appeal, as entertainment, but I think we need to broaden our conception of what's acceptable entertainment.
Well, out of respect, thank you, David. So out of respect for everyone's time, it's almost time for the webinar to be over. We still have 25 questions to answer. So we will be getting back to you. I will put a FAQ together that will go out to everyone on this webinar so we can see the questions and David's answers and get them out to everyone. So Kathy, would you get to the next slide? So thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Great to have you here. You are a rock star. We will be archiving this webinar along with the slides and the reports from Child Trends on our website. We will send you an email about that. If you have questions you can contact me or Kathy. Here's the usual stuff about how people stay in touch these days, especially for those newbies. We will be putting you on our email list because we know you're interested in ACEs, and we have a program called Mind Matters, which addresses ACEs and how to help young people heal. So you'll probably want to know about that. Next one. So in August, this is our second Wednesday webinar. Every month we have a free webinar. Next month, we're going to talk about our 2 evidence-based programs, Love Notes and Relationship Smarts Plus, which have been updated for the hashtag #MeToo and hashtag, it's on us generation, including consent and sexual assault and cyberbullying and sexting and all of that. So we look forward to seeing you next month. And thank you again, David. Thank you, Kathy. And we'll send out all this information as we get it posted. Thank you.
Thank you.